Afternoon, everyone. Great to have you with us. My name is Ceri Thomas, one of the editors here at Tortoise, and thanks to everyone for joining us at this open news thinking. As you know, I think by now this is thinking every week where we just try to chew on some things that are in the news, and so I think today we're going to start by looking at the sort of various things swirling around Downing Street and just see whether we can make some sense of them. I'm going to lean quite heavily on fellow editor Matt D'Ancona, Chris Cook and others. Really want to hear what you think as well. You probably know the format by now. The idea here is no questions, that we want to know what you think, what you understand. We want to really help us by giving us a better informed point of view about this story that we're still in the middle of. I also do want to talk a little bit today about, we've done these podcasts this week, or more specifically, I've done them this week, which are about notionally about Harvey Procter, former Tory MP, but also trying to look at the way that interplay between the press and politics and the police, how that the outcomes that can have for people who get caught up in the machinery in the way that Harvey Procter did. So I've got my friend and colleague Alistair Jackson, who's done those podcasts with me on the call as well, and I think we're trying to work out what we do with that as a story, because there's quite a lot in there, and so we'll probably pick your brains about that as well towards the end. But let's kick off with Downing Street, and I suppose if nothing else, what's going on is, so we're days away from a set of quite important elections. So there's that. Normally you'd think that's a bad moment to have a crisis. This thing has got range. You know, it goes from the handling of the pandemic through to the decorating of a flat, quite a broad waterfront. It's got personal feuding. It's got sort of standards in public life questions. So there's quite a mix of things there, and it does feel as if it's running away from Downing Street. So I think it doesn't feel at all to me as if it's played out yet. But Matt D'Ancona, if you're out there, can I bring you in first? You around?
Sure. Hi, Ceri.
Hello, Matt. I guess what I'd love to just run through with you now is just to remind us what's happened, and then try and figure out what it means. I think it's still unclear whether this is a big one or one we're going to have got that in a few months' time.
Well, I mean, obviously, it seems an age ago now, but it started with the row over David Cameron lobbying on behalf of Green Cell for special access with Rishi Sunak, and various other elements of Green Cell sort of seeking greater access to bits of government, and whether that was correctly done. And that was sort of part one. And there was a few days where I think number 10 was quietly quite happy, because it felt, well, you know, there's my predecessor, David Cameron, and my potential rival Rishi Sunak embroiled in a row. But it's sort of metastasized into something a lot bigger, which obviously has been weaponized and turbocharged by the involvement of Dominic Cummings, who left Downing Street in November as Johnson's senior advisor, and is a master manipulator of media and the dark arts of you know, emotional manipulation. And there is no doubt that there is profound alarm in number 10. You know, I've spoken to people there in the last 48 hours about what he might have, because he is someone who is always thinking several steps ahead. And so the rumors in particular that he might have audio files is causing genuine terror, because it's one thing to say the Prime Minister said this. It's quite another to have a recording. And so they're very alarmed about that. Also, I think two other things. One is that the row about the flat, and Danny Finkelstein, I think, wrote a very good piece about this in the Times, which is that, yes, it's not actually the greatest crime in the world, but it's something that people can understand. I mean, the sums of money in Greensill, billions, hundreds of millions, are almost incomprehensible. But the idea that somehow, I think first of all, taxpayers will be surprised to learn that they have to pony up 30 grand a year to keep the Prime Minister's flat in good nick. And then the idea that somehow he was fiddling party money in order to get an extra top up. These are forms of whatever you want to call it, sleaze. Doesn't really qualify as full-blown corruption, but people can understand, which is why the parliamentary expenses row was so desperately damaging, because it involved stuff that everyone does, like, do up their house, or, do things in their garden, or pay for this or pay for that item around the house. And it was very relatable. So there's that. And then the other thing, which is deeply alarming to Number 10 and has come out in this, alleged and disputed quote about Johnson saying he would rather see the bodies piling up than sign off a third lockdown, is that clearly there was a great deal of, we've covered this at Tortoise at various stages, but the depths of the discord within Number 10 over lockdown 2 were profound, and clearly Cummings kept detailed files and has made it very clear that there are things that will embarrass Johnson and perhaps others profoundly. So I agree with you completely, Ceri. I think it's nowhere near blowing itself out of steam. The constant refrain is, look, he's still ahead in the polls. He's insulated. Johnson is still insulated by Keir Starmer's failure to cut through and the success of the vaccine rollout, and all that is true. But what we've learned in past iterations of sleaze is that what you do with it is you just keep saying it until you hit a critical mass where people start to say it themselves, and where it starts to mesh with the sense that a government is jaded and not really doing its job, and then it becomes absolutely lethal. So I think this has been a very significant development in the history of the Johnson premiership.
Yeah. And Matt, would you do us a favour, because this is supposed to be the sensible Downing Street operation. This is the one that replaced Lee Kane and Dominic Cummings. Just run us through the sort of cast of characters, would you? Who's around Boris Johnson in there, making the calls about what to leak, what not to leak, how to respond at moments like this?
Well, I mean, the key players, I suppose, are, to go through it, Simon Case, the cabinet secretary, who was eviscerated yesterday by a parliamentary select committee. I don't know if people who are old enough to remember the character Arthur Pusey that Michael Palin played, the accountant in Monty Python, but Simon Case is a dead ringer for Arthur Pusey, who was an accountant who wanted to be a lion tamer. And, when you think of sort of giants who've held that role, like Jeremy Hayward and Gus O'Donnell and Robin Butler and Robin Armstrong, he came across as a sort of nervous bureaucrat, completely unable to deal with the increasingly frustrated questions of MPs. So but he's the man who's meant to be running the show, and crucially, meant to be orchestrating all the inquiries into ethical controversies in and around Number 10. So there's him. There's the Chief of Staff, Dan Rosenfeld, who I think one of the interesting allegations at the weekend was that he met Woodward of Manchester United to talk about the Super League, and I think that may return to haunt them. His deputy is Simon Finn, who used to work for Francis Maud and is good friends with Michael Gove. Henry Newman again, a former very close advisor to Gove, now senior advisor to Boris Johnson. Interestingly, lots of churn on the communications side. There was so much talk about Allegra Stratton being the new, formerly working at the Treasury and distinguished journalist in the past. She was going to be the sort of CJ Craig, for people who like The West Wing, the face of the new televised press conferences. And she has, and her arrival at the end of last year was seen as, you know, part of the end of the Cummings era, as all of the old Vote Leave gang, Cummings and Lee Kane and everyone, were evicted. But Allegra has been shunted aside really to handle comms for COP26. Now it's not, you know, that's not a small job, but as compared to being the kind of the face of the administration, the person who does the televised press conferences, it's obviously a demotion. So what you're seeing is a great deal of churn, not much stability. And Eddie Lister, who was Johnson's great sort of, you know, Gandalf figure, always keeping him on the right lines at City Hall when Boris was Mayor of London, has now left Number 10 for good, and that's a big loss. I mean, it's a big personal loss to Johnson. So what you're seeing is a huge amount of churn. And yes, you know, the Vote Leave gang have gone, but they've not been replaced by a settled group who are now going to seize the reins and make everything okay. The instability within it's a very, very febrile atmosphere.
Matt, have you been surprised by the fact that they've just seemed to have decided to go to war with Dominic Cummings? Given, as I said, this was supposed to be the sort of sensible Downing Street crew. Did that decision surprise you?
Yes, and I think that the way you phrase the question is the right way, which is that the crew were not keen on this at all. This was the Prime Minister himself. And, you know, it is now absolutely clear that Johnson was phoning newspaper editors, fingering Cummings as the chatty rat, as the mole. And, you know, I know of at least one, I've spoken to at least one of the closest advisors who specifically and explicitly said to the PM, don't do this. You know, this is exactly what Cummings wants you to do, which is to go to war with him and enable him to turn this into a asymmetric warfare, where of course you'll have the big machinery of government on your side, but he, Cummings, who has little to lose, will be able to do anything he wants. And we Number 10 don't know what he's got. I mean, that's the crucial problem here, is that they don't know whether he has tapes. They don't know what documents he's got. You know, he's shown in the past that he's more than willing to break the rules. Yet, you know, they've been sending up flares that Cummings shouldn't forget that he's a signatory to the Official Secrets Act. But I don't think that will stop him from taking his revenge.
And actually, I was going to pick your brains about that fact that Boris Johnson has been calling newspaper editors. Now, look, you've been high up in newspapers, you know, prime ministers will call editors, but I can't remember a prime minister calling an editor about something that seems as trivial as this. As trivial and personal and bitter as this.
I mean, you know what it's like. It's those calls are few and far between, and they're usually over something. They're made to editors about things like, we're going to war with Iraq tomorrow, or I need to tell you something on background that you can't report yet, but we'll be able to next week. I mean, it's that sort of level of seriousness. The idea that essentially Boris is now acting as a special advisor, a junior special advisor, planting poison in the ears of senior editors, shows you his state of mind, and also I think demeans him in the eyes of, will demean him in the eyes of editors, because everyone is pleased to receive a call from any prime minister because you get, what better access. But on the other hand, if they're calling out just to say it was Dom, that's not very statesmanlike. So
No.
there is a whiff of loss of control about it all.
Yeah.
Of someone who is now behaving not just in his sort of normal seat of the pants way, which we're very familiar with, but actually in an actively reckless fashion.
Yeah. Matt, don't go away. I'll come back to you. And I'm going to come to Ian Campbell, because Ian, you've been quite active in the chat, and I just want to pick up some of the things you've been saying there. But Chris Cook, are you there? Lots of clicking.
Yes, I am. Hello.
Chris, what are you making of all this?
So I think there's a so I think it's important.
Go on,
so
tell me why. Tell me why.
Yeah. So I think it's important because for a few reasons. So I think it's very striking how much energy this is all taking up. This is a sort of slightly self-fulfilling thing that if we focus on it, it takes up energy and everything else. But there are the reasons that governments don't do this stuff typically is to avoid this sort of drain, and it sort of shows like a lack of core professionalism, I think, in Downing Street. They've managed to get themselves entangled in this. On the money stuff, so that I was trying to work it out yesterday about what the law is on political parties and cash, because the primary legislation itself is not very clear. But if you look at the PPRA, which is the act that regulates political parties, you have to see them, I think, as being akin to charities, right? So the parties are effectively trusts with a set of objectives, like a charity is a trust that has people in charge of it and a set of objectives. But it's regulated obviously rather than by the Charity Commission, by the Electoral Commission. And whereas there's loads of guidance about charities on how to meet their objectives and the importance of objectives, there's not really anything for political parties that's analogous. But what we can say is if this were a charity, and if the regulation of political parties is read across from this analogous legal situation, it's absolutely clear that if you take money from a donor that's been given to advance the cause of conservatism in the United Kingdom, and you use it to repair someone's kitchen, that is fraud, right? That's straight up and down fraud. And the difficulty is the Electoral Commission is even worse as a regulator than the Charity Commission. The law is fuzzier. There's also a secondary thing here, which is that even if the party always intended to solicit a donation to cover this, so that it wouldn't be that someone's selling raffle tickets in Rutland to make money for the future of conservatism, so it was known to the donor, there is still a problem with that, because it means it was a disguised donation that the party has hushed up.
Yeah. So Chris, I've a couple of things I've read suggested to me that the PPERA, as you said, the Political Parties, Elections and Referendums Act, might not come into play here, because that really governs campaigning and political activity. Whereas the Ministerial Code, which is more to do with declarations of interest and transparency, that might be where the real action is. Does that seem more likely to you as the kind of the locus for this?
So I think the two things are incredibly weak, right? The two mechanisms we're talking about are both very poor mechanisms. You're right. The PPRA focuses on campaigns, and the Electoral Commission is really interested in campaigns, not really interested between elections, but they are also the regulator of these weird trusts. Like the Conservative Party is not incorporated except as an election fighting trust, basically. It has corporations attached and around it, but the party itself, the thing that is given the money for the getting rid of John Lewis, is this thing that's regulated by the Electoral Commission. So I think the PPRA might end up being the thing that matters, because there's just nothing else in that space. The Ministerial Code, you have to see the Ministerial Code as a fraud, right? The Ministerial Code is a ruse by the government to protect the government, right? It does not exist to do anything that the government does not want to do. What it does is it creates a rule set that's all about that to apply to to ministerial conduct that allows ministers to defend themselves. It doesn't. It's not there to cause trouble for the government.
Yeah.
The executive has not written a rule book that constrains the executive, right?
So in that sense, it's more like an IQ test than a sort of test of.
Do you remember when Damien Green resigned? They updated the ministerial code because it wasn't clear in the ministerial code that you weren't allowed to do the things that I don't want to go into what Damien Green was accused of doing, but it turns out that lying about having pornography on your work computer was it turns out wasn't explicitly ruled out in the ministerial code, so they had to rewrite it. And that's sort of the point, is that it's designed to have lacunae in it so that you can always argue your way through. So when Suella Braverman broke the ministerial code by advocating as Attorney General breaking the law, the argument that they put forward was that the ministerial code did not countenance international law. The other thing about the ministerial code is it's all just the Prime Minister, right? There's no independent person. There's no independent person. They used to have an independent advisor on the ministerial code, a guy called Alex Allen, who is, for want of a better word, a complete patsy, right? His job is, it really said something about this government, actually, that they managed to get him to resign, because his job was just to nod along and say whatever the government had done was fine. Like he's a guy that actually got criticised by a judge in 2013 for lying to a court in order to keep to justify not releasing FOI requests, right? He is a patsy, and like the whole thing is designed to stop you from being able to hold anyone accountable.
Yeah.
The judge at the end of it is the Prime Minister. The advisor is appointed by the Prime Minister. There's nothing else there.
Chris, I guess the immediate, or not immediate, but imminent decision that Boris Johnson will have to take is about declaration of financial interest, isn't it? He's got he's overdue already, I think, isn't that right? And that actually, so just if you were in Downing Street, how would you be thinking about that calculation about when to front up on the money?
I think you've got to go as quickly as possible, really. I think it's the only way. Like, it's going to keep going until it's the only thing in town until they front it up. Basically, is this? Well, this is one of the multiple crises that they're fronting up at the moment. But the only way to staunch this is to be clear, not just about who is given the final the loan, right, that is now received, when he decided to repay it, and what the original intentions at each point were, and why they thought they were justifiable. I mean, I could see that if they'd said, so that the Cabinet Office paid up front for the works, it seems, then CCHQ repaid that, then they found a donor to match that cost, and then it seems that Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, has told the Prime Minister, actually, you're not going to be allowed to do that, you're going to have to repay that yourself. Why they thought at each stage this was permissible is actually quite important, because I mean, people should care about this stuff, because this is people trying to get around the transparency laws, people don't hide this stuff for no reason. Bluntly, it is very striking that the worst run departments in Whitehall are the ones that are the most secretive about everything. Like, the Cabinet Office does not run anything well. The Cabinet Office is the most secretive place on earth. The Department for Education is a basket case. It's also a place you can't get an FOI request through, right? Like, these things run together, and like, it's just plumes of smoke coming out of Downing Street about all this stuff at the moment.
All right, listen, I want to just get some views from outside the sort of glamorous quadrant of Southeast London where Matt and Chris live. So let me, Ian Campbell, are you out there? Because you've been busy in the chat, and if you're like, just love to know, just again, a general take on this. Are you in Scotland? I'm inferring that from the chat.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
What have you made of it so far, this whole saga?
Well, I think from a Scottish point of view, what's interesting is that Boris Johnson remains unpopular up here. It's not really made much difference. I think the only thing that really has been mentioned up here is the COVID comments. That was a bit of a news story yesterday. But apart from that, everything else just not really become an issue in the Scottish elections, because a lot of it is just the kind of churn that people can expect from kind of Westminster politics. So it's interesting, because previously it used to be a bigger issue, but it seems to have just been forgotten about. It's just as if, like, we expect that from kind of Westminster politicians. But another point that's interesting about it is that Starmer's response, Keir Starmer's response, has not come through as an issue either. It's not what he's said in reply to what's going on has just not been reported. So I think the fact that he's not really breaking through, making an impact from his response to what's going on is also quite an interesting aspect to it.
Yeah, and is it the case, Ian, that this is playing lower down the news agenda in Scotland because all eyes are on, national Scottish matters ahead of the elections?
Yes, but that's not always been the case. Like, I think in the past, these issues have become issues up here because it's being seen as important, but they're not being seen as important because it's seen as a Westminster bubble issue. I think that's quite an interesting change, and especially with the decline of the Labour Party up here, their response is not getting reported as much as it would have been in previous years and previous elections in 2016, 2011. There was definitely much more response, much more reporting of Labour's response to what was going on.
Okay.
Just because it was felt during an election time, the media felt they had to report this. But I think because Starmer's not saying anything particularly interesting about it, it's not really being reported. So I think that's really interesting to see what effect that has on the Labour Party vote in the elections next week.
Yeah. Okay. Can I just bring Jennifer Allison in? Because Jennifer, you just made an interesting comment in the chat there about the way you think voters are being treated on this. And I guess what we're part of what we're trying to work out here is how important this is going to turn out to be. What's your sense of whether this is a big scandal, a medium one, or a sort of storm in a teacup?
That's difficult to say because I don't necessarily talk to lots of other people who have voted about this. But the thing I got from, so it was about the comments that Charles Walker made on Newsnight last night, which was basically, oh, it's not an issue because taxpayers don't care because it's not coming out of, taxpayer money. It's something else. And it's kind of treating the voter as this homogenous blob that is a group of people who know nothing about politics in Westminster and, only care about a limited number of things and are generally less intelligent than the politicians themselves. And it is, it's that impression that you get that is reinforced when these Tory politicians come on and comment on how they assume the voter feels about an issue, is very much treating them as, which is us, which is every individual across the country who is eligible to vote, which is, parents and grandparents and children and scientists and doctors. And, it's not a homogenous blob of people who only think, oh, well, I tick a box once every few years and I'll just hope that my money is spent in a relatively, sensible way. It's
actually, I think you put some
undermining how much voters actually care about the integrity of politicians.
Yeah, but I think you're totally right. That's in the end, that's what this is all about, isn't it? Because the line from Charles Walker, from every other minister who sent out is, he repaid the money. He paid in the end. So forget the process, forget what got us there. Forget, as Chris was saying, that it got nodded through all these places where maybe some qualms and concerns should have been raised. In the end, what's the fuss about? Boris Johnson paid the money, paid the bill. Where would you come down on that, just personally?
Personally, no, I think it is incredibly important. It is about integrity, and if you're specifically covering something, it was I can't remember if it's Chris or Matt who said it now, but it is that you're covering it up for a reason. You're not, they're purposely not telling people about these things, and there is a reason for that. And yeah, it is definitely something that matters. It's not just, oh well, it hasn't cost us anything at the end of the day, and it undermines, it's saying the voter isn't that intelligent, doesn't really understand the fact that private donors will give huge sums of money with the expectation of something in return.
Yeah, something unspecified.
That's what people don't like about, massive donations to these big parties. But yeah.
Yeah, Jennifer, thanks so much. Sam Houston, are you out there, Sam? Because I was intrigued by what you were saying, which sort of pushes back a little bit in the other direction, I suppose, that that there might be a pushback if this were to cause real trouble for Boris Johnson. That might be seen as you're always in the car or a taxi. It's like a feature.
It's a cab, my cab. That's why I'm always in it.
That would explain it.
Yeah, I'm not driving, but yeah, greetings from the cab. Yeah, sorry, I am late to this, but I did want to put the view that the other thing I wanted to say was that people have a different idea of what corruption is, so I think that, when we talk about the current sleaze and all that, it's not a new thing, is it? Tory sleaze, we've had that before, and I think people that I know kind of roll their eyes, and they do complain about it and they do moan about it, but kind of weirdly, it doesn't change the fact that this government was voted in, and it was voted in for a certain reason, and it achieved a strong majority to achieve a certain goal, and people voted for that, and those voters are not going to want this government removed just because of stuff that they kind of take for granted in government. And then the other thing I'd say about corruption is that just again, people I know look at corruption in different ways. They think that if there's a kind of media homogeneity where there's a central message about all sorts of different things, and other people's views are not taken into account, that is a form of corruption. So I think that coalition that voted this government in is a broad one, perhaps not as broad as the coalition that Labour would need, but people had a lot of criticism for Tony Blair, in particular his government, but in particular what he did after his government. So really, it's just that to say we talk a lot, don't we, about what it might take to get rid of Boris Johnson, but I think quite a number of people that I know, if he were to be deposed for any reason, would see that as quite undemocratic.
Yeah. So Sam, if I put to you the same question I put to Jennifer, if personally, as long as Boris Johnson has paid the money in the end, does that kill this stone dead as far as you're concerned, or does the process trouble you?
Well, personally, I kind of look at it with a sort of a jaded eye. I mean, it's going to roll on and on. I mean, these things are, there's a drip quality to this stuff, so it's going to be a question of what can be built up and all of this, but I think the fundamental kind of metrics haven't changed. They've got an 80-seat majority, so it would take an awful lot for Tory MPs to kind of want to risk a leadership challenge and or potentially a general election or any of that. I don't see the calculus changing with any of this unless something really, really big is out there.
Yeah. All right, Sam, thanks for joining us again. Matt Dancona, let me come back to you, because I think you probably, as much as anyone, are going to have a slightly depressing feeling that in the end, maybe this is not going to, maybe all this kind of behavior is so heavily discounted that shouting Tory sleaze now is just not going to play in the way that it played back in the day.
Well, I think things like sleaze, as with spin under New Labour, become dangerous if they speak to a broader anxiety. So I think if you just are sort of enumerating a list of vaguely dodgy things or seriously dodgy things that the government has done, but you're dealing with an electorate that is fundamentally content and reasonably prosperous, and feels that the country's being governed competently, and I'm not saying that's the case, I'm just saying if that's all true, it won't bite. I think when sleaze, I think spin started to damage Labour when there was a sense that as a word when there was a sense that there was a serious gap between what the government was saying and what it was doing, and that it was over claiming and in fact in some cases telling serious lies. I think what will happen with sleaze, it will become dangerous is for the Johnson regime if post-pandemic, when we're all over vaccine euphoria, people start to feel the pain of the recession, and form the view that the government is really not competent, a bit jaded. The Tories have been in power already for 11 years, and they start to get the feeling this is just a self-serving oligarchy that is in power just to be in power, and in order to fleece us so they can have nice wallpaper and good jobs when they leave government. And that's when it becomes lethal, as it did under John Major in the period 92-97. Major himself, definitely not a sleazy person personally, but his government was seen as sleazy precisely because it was perceived as being useless, out of date, a bit brown at the edges, and in comparison to this new shiny wonderful thing called New Labour, well past its sell-by date. The problem in this instance is that there isn't yet that alternative. That Starmer is still in the foothills at best of bringing the Labour Party back to the point where it's ready to be in government again.
Yeah. Matt, I'm just going to pick up with you on something in the chat, which I think is really my fault, but you're getting in the neck of it as well, which is why are we using the word sleaze? I think I started that, but why are we not saying corruption? Would we, if this was abroad, would we be saying straight up corruption, do you think?
Oh, and that's an easy question to answer, and it's a historic one, and it goes back to the pre-digital era, which was the tabloids used sleaze because it fitted into a headline. And I remember when I was at the Sunday Telegraph at that time, big internal debates about whether we use the word sleaze, which we thought was rather sleazy. And I think that we came up with a classic sort of SDP-ish kind of compromise that we would use. If we use sleaze, we'd put it in inverted commas, which is extremely cowardly. But it isn't a good word. The reason politicians who are attacking sleaze use it is precisely because it's vague, and that it can encompass anything from sexual misconduct to serious financial corruption. So that's the reason Labour are using it. But I think it's a legitimate question as to whether the media should echo it.
Well, what about us? Do you think we at Tortoise should we? I can see Liz Mosley in the chat saying we need a whole new word, but I'm not sure I've got a whole new word. But should we at Tortoise just say corruption? Is it clear enough corruption to use?
Well, the problem with using the word corruption, of course, is that you're then into the realms of defamation, because to accuse anyone of corruption is essentially accusing them. You could argue there are forms of ethical corruption which aren't illegal, but it is pretty defamatory. So they're not quite the same. Sleaze is helpfully vague, but I agree. I think we need to use some more precise language, and perhaps not to include all these sins in the same bin, as it were, because they're not all of equal importance, although they may all flow from, and this is the real question, is it? Do they all flow from a fundamental rottenness at the top of the government? I mean, is that really what this is all about? That this is a government, and indeed, the behaviour of Cameron apparently suggests that it predates Boris, that takes these matters in a very light and amoral fashion. But I'm always in favour of linguistic precision, so I'm open to suggestion.
Well, Liz is suggesting away in the chat like a good one. So we've had Tory deceit and Tory rot so far. So
that's not bad.
Keep going, Liz. Keep going.
Not bad.
Chris, let me come back to you before we just move on to something else. On that fundamental question, is it reasonable to describe this as corruption, do you think? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, so my drilling has just started next door, so I might be quite hard to hear. But I think so the reason for using sleaze is because it's a broader word, right? It includes like personal misconduct stuff about, say, whether. So there is sort of concern about, say, the role of Carrie Simons and the relationship with external people, and we might not think anyone's getting rich out of it. We might think it's unseemly at the very least. So I think that's the point of sleaze. It sort of encompasses that. And in the 90s, obviously sleaze very much encompassed, Jeffrey Archer and lots of sexual misconduct that was not, we wouldn't consider corruption. Like, David Mellor is the archetype of sleaze. Yeah. So I think that's the sort of reason for that. I think. So what was your?
I was just wondering, actually, just trying to get you to test for us whether you think if we were confident we would use the word corruption. Does it meet the test? Are we talking about things that meet that standard, I suppose?
So I think part of the issue is, I think it implies a level of personal enrichment for the politicians, which I'm not sure is totally where we are. I think a lot of this is doing favors for people who we like and we think are good chaps, and we want to. But I guess, so the cronyism is the other word people use for it. I think fundamentally that's the sort of unease I would have about it. I wouldn't, to put it the other way around, if we ran a load of stuff talking about this as corruption, I wouldn't have a problem with it. I'm not sure it's totally what the average reader would understand as corruption. That's the thing. Like, I feel like, how much money is Boris Johnson making from corruption if he's
Yep.
I think that's sort of how I think it's just a sort of, does the reader understand it to be what we mean it to mean?
Yep.
Is the thing. Cronyism I'm happy with, because everyone understands what that means. It is corruption. We could call it corruption, but that's the question for me, is whether it's precise enough.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to come to William Jeremy, who I think has got his hand up, and then last word on this to you, William. Where are you?
Hello. Yes, I think all this does matter. I think it speaks to a very deeply ingrained narrative, which Matt brilliantly brought out in his piece, that it speaks to an idea that they're both Cummings and Johnson are deeply both entitled to a way of living and a life and an outlook which somehow breaks rules when they want to, and also lives above the hoi polloi, which is us. I think it also speaks to a mendacity which seems to be gripping, if not the heart of government, then certainly a sensibility in and around it, that you can say things that are just this side of propaganda, and you can do things with a sort of impunity which won't be caught up with. And I think we do have to cling to the idea of Martin Luther King's sensibility, which when he said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think what he meant by that in the broad scheme of things is that people's wrongdoing from a moral sensibility eventually catches up with them somehow. Now you've got to have a subscribe to that, I guess. But I think these small in inverted commas, depending on how you look at these things, but both the big things and the smaller things do matter. It's about conduct, it's about moral sensibility, it's about understanding that there are a lot of people who don't live as you do or have a makeup in the same way. So it's a sort of empathy gap too.
Okay, William, thank you.
That's my general, that's it.
Okay, we've got my colleague Giles Whittell pointing out that in effect, I think he thinks the government has got a kind of vaccine passport that will get it out of this, that a government that can deliver vaccines, and Brexit has got its major priorities lined up, and nothing else is really going to matter. So there's Giles. Okay, listen, I'm going to beg your indulgence for the remaining sort of 10-12 minutes of this thinking, which is just because we've published these podcasts this week, or we're in the middle of publishing them, which are nominally about Harvey Proctor, former Tory MP, long ago, so left the Commons in '87. But I think a way to try to look at the interplay between the media and the police and public sentiment and what that can do to people, even difficult characters like Harvey Proctor. He's quite he was an extremely right-wing MP back in the 1980s. Not an attractive character at all. And in that sense, he's a useful test of whether sort of hard law makes bad cases, as people used to say. I think in sort of free speech in this kind of area, you could argue that hard law is exactly the test that you need to apply. But because I appreciate that. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because I think we're interested in what the lessons are, what we might do with that story, and appreciating that a number of you won't have heard the stuff that we've done. Alistair Jackson, who's been doing these podcasts with me, is out there. Al, can I just turn to you to just, for people who haven't, been sat in front of a microphone like we have for the last little while, what have we been trying to do in these podcasts, would you say?
Gosh, I suppose we were trying to, as you say, sort of look at one particular story. We could have chosen lots of people that were on the Operation Midland story, all who've had a similar sort of consequences. But as we said at the start, there was something about Proctor that was different. He wasn't the sort of totem of the establishment like Bramwell in the military or Ted Heath as a former Prime Minister was. So it was for me, it was interesting, having been on the story for so long, doing the sort of granular detail to ask questions, which was why Proctor, and that led us to his previous, if you like, and whether that infected people's decisions. And by people, what we didn't just mean the police, did we, or journalists, the kind of things I've been concentrating on, reporting it at Panorama and elsewhere, but all of us. And I think it was quite a useful exercise to take a story like that and to sort of spread the thinking about it a bit more broadly, and in terms of whether we achieved that. I mean, I suppose from a personal point of view, having been on it for so long, it actually made me think about the story in a very different way, and actually the lessons we take from it in a different way. So, I personally hope that people who might have some awareness of the Operation Midland story and all that get that as well from listening to the podcast.
Yeah, just because I think a lot of people probably won't have heard of Operation Midland, or will have forgotten all about it. Just to give that bit of context, just to talk us through the two big scandals which have affected Harvey Proctor's life, which were a sort of tabloid sting in '86, '87, and then Operation Midland. Just give us the sort of elevator understanding of those two things so that we're all kind of on the same page.
Sure. Well, I mean, as you say, Proctor had this controversial political sort of background, being, I mean, every time we met him, Enoch Powell's name comes up, doesn't it, right to the fore to start with. And then in around about 86, 87, he got stung by the Sunday People, but all the other papers piled in because he'd been using what was then called rent boys who'd obviously gone to the papers, told him what was happening, and they put an audio device on him and stung him, and he was splashed all over the papers. And because he didn't resign immediately, that carried on for sort of, right up to the next election where he stood down. So when you go through the cuts, you can see this was brutal, and the language used was brutal. He was dragged into the aspect of his life that he wanted to keep private, and eventually he sort of disappeared to the countryside in Leicestershire. We never heard from him again until about 30 years later. This guy called Carl Beach appeared, making these very wide and horrific allegations against a group of establishment figures, child torture, and through the murders of 3 children, 2 of which Proctor was directly responsible with. So he'd sort of gone from quite literally being in the middle of nowhere to standing outside his country cottage with the national media trying to murderer. So they were the 2 great exposes. I mean, one when he was very much in the public eye as a controversial politician, and the second when, and I think you can believe him about this. He'd literally disappeared at that point. So I mean, that's what's interesting. He had these 2 great scandals in his life. One when he was well known, and the other one he was absolutely dragged back into the limelight by a fantasist. And of course, the interesting aspect of it alongside that was how that fantasist was taken seriously by the police and by certain aspects of the media. And that very much prolonged Proctor's pain, of course, because of this guy was judged to be telling the truth by the police very early on. And he himself really had to correct that by doing a very dramatic expose press conference. Guy he was extremely painful because he had to admit describe his sexuality and everything else, and that's really what one episode of the podcast is largely on. So it's a heck of a life story. That much is for true. That much is certain.
Al, just before I try to bring some other people in, you said that going back to this story, so the Operation Midland begins in 2014, sort of wraps up in 2016.
15,
yeah.
14, 15, yeah.
When you said that you sort of thought differently about it, having come back to it all these years later.
Mm.
What have you thought differently about this time?
Gosh, well, I think the thing is when you're sort of enmeshed in the sort of press conferences, daily reporting of it, this joins up the dots, doesn't it? This podcast, but it joins up the dots going right back to almost Proctor's childhood, because of his extreme views on immigration were born out of his childhood, it seems, from the interviews he's given us. And it's quite, and then when you join those dots up, and I suppose I hadn't really thought about where I started from on the story, because in my head is the end point. But actually, when Proctor's name was first mentioned in this landscape of VIP allegations, this has made me think, well, actually, when I heard Proctor's name, I had this dim awareness of a guy with a past and a rumor of violence in his past because of these sex offences. So that was quite a sort of, corrective thing for me, really, to think, there's a real danger for anybody, really, that you can take, you can almost subconsciously start a story with baggage, inevitably, that can be quite damaging. So I suppose that's what it made me think about.
Yeah. Okay, Al, thank you. Actually, Liz Mosley, can I get some help from you as well? Because you, I think, were coming fairly fresh to this. So I was talking to James Harding this morning. We're thinking, what do we, we quite like the life story and the sort of tensions and the sort of switchbacks within it, but are we doing enough to try to sort of make sense of it, to locate it, to try and think about what it all really means? I think you're a couple of episodes in, aren't you, or nearly?
Yeah.
Where do you think we might sort of push a bit harder or go with this?
You mean after the next 2 episodes have come out, you mean?
Yeah, we're definitely doing those, yeah.
I mean, I have to say, because I've only heard the first 2. I have a question, I guess, rather than answer to the one you've asked, which I'll do first, which is episode 1. The whole thing is, how do we treat people that we hate, to use the word that you keep using throughout, and you talk about your own personal response when Harvey Procter sort of went down the first time in the 80s. There was a sort of sense of glee, although non-specific glee, that had happened or whatever. Yeah. It might be the wrong word, but you're sort of carelessly pleased because he was a guy that had these views about immigration.
Liz, can you do me a favour, because I just need to go and help someone who's hurt themselves outside the door here. Yeah, just bear with me a second.
Oh goodness, okay. And Al might be able to answer the question. And I wasn't sure in the first episode whether the view now, as we look back, was that the reason the tabloid press went for him in the 80s was because he was very unpopular, because he was this awful anti-immigration Enoch Powell friend of, and that was the reason. And the fact that he was gay and paying men for sex was a sort of convenient way of getting him, or if it was just that the press was homophobic, so let's bring him down for fun. I couldn't quite tell.
Well, I guess to fudge it all, I suppose it's a combination of all of them, but I suppose the thing was he was certainly high profile because of his extreme views. I mean, the bit about going to, even from when he was a student, and then when he was expressing these views, he would go around the countryside, talk at student unions. So he was very much putting himself out there, if you like, which I guess on just a fundamental level made him worthy of interest for the tabloids, because he was a profile. Then his views, I think, certainly wanted people to, made him a target. And it was the Sunday People, of course, that, a left-leaning paper that went for him at a time when, exposing someone's sexuality, possibly with a background of fear about the AIDS pandemic, which was looming and made it currency, was a kind of perfect storm, I suppose. But I think you're right to identify, personally speaking, looking back, his extreme political views, would be the starting point. And he didn't tend to back away from those. He was dreadful phrase, probably good copy, as well, to go for someone to go for, tabloid to go for. So it was a perfect storm, and they managed to, they managed in their terms, I suppose, to hit the jackpot, because they had, they exposed something in his private life. They brought down a guy that was making a lot of noise, and it went on and on and on. So the sort of tabloid frenzy wasn't just a weekend wonder. It was, it was going on and on and on, every aspect of his life, previous boyfriends, his partner, as he says in the podcast, week after week after week. So they got a lot of bang for their buck, I think, with Harvey.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's a lot to reflect on. The other thing that one of the other things that I've been just chewing over to myself is that there's a characterization, I think it's in episode 2, of the way that his colleagues in the Tory party look out for him in that awful time in the 80s, and they sort of bring him to sit with them on the front bench. I'm not talking about the Matthew Paris thing, which is slightly different and more personal, but the sort of public face the Tory party supported him in and sort of carried sort of comments, perhaps the politicians responded differently than you might have expected. There is another read on that, which is the Tory party looking after their own again. Is that you can adjust your lens just a little bit, and you can see it in those terms as well, which, given the conversation we've just been having, I also think is interesting. I have to say, I'm not sure I've got anything massively useful about what happens next until I've heard the next 2 episodes, but it's completely gripping. I very much enjoyed it.
Good.
Thank you for stepping in there. And so I think we can leave it there for now, can't we? Because what we really want, I suppose, is to help answer that question that James and I were wrestling with this morning, which is, are we doing enough with this story? What interests you about it? Where should we go with it next? So as and when, and if you have a chance to listen, please do. We'd be very grateful. And then just get in touch with me, Ceri at tortoisemedia.com, and love to know where you think, what gaps we've left or where we might go further with things. Right. Liz, you might want to pop downstairs and help with my crisis. But let me say thanks to everyone for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow evening for Thinking as usual. Bye for now.